There is something peculiarly English, I've always thought, about the way a country house can make even the most innocent gathering feel like a conspiracy. It was with this uncomfortable reflection that I found myself, on a bitter November evening, standing in the great hall of Thornfield Abbey, a magnificent Tudor manor house nestled in the rolling hills of the Cotswold. "Mon ami," said Hercule Poirot, adjusting his immaculate evening coat as we paused beneath the vaulted ceiling. "Observe the atmosphere of this place, the portraits that watch from their frames, the shadows that gather in the corners. It is a house that keeps secrets, no?" I glanced around at the ancient tapestries and suits of armor that lined the walls, illuminated by the flickering light of numerous candles in silver sconces. Our hostess, Lady Catherine Thornfield. She had insisted upon candlelight throughout the house, claiming that electric lighting was vulgar and harsh. The effect was undeniably dramatic, though I couldn't shake the feeling that it was somehow ominous as well. "My dear Poirot," I murmured, "you make it sound as though we've been invited to witness a murder." His green eyes twinkled with that familiar mixture of amusement and keen intelligence. "Perhaps, Hastings, we have been invited to prevent one." The letter that had summoned us from London had been both urgent and cryptic. Lady Catherine Thornfield, widow of the late industrial magnate Sir Henry Thornfield, had written in evident distress about certain malicious communications that had been received by various members of her family. "These anonymous letters," she explained, contained threats and insinuations of the most disturbing nature, and she feared they might lead to consequences too dreadful to contemplate. She had concluded with a plea that Poirot might lend his expertise to a family in desperate need of discretion and resolution. What had particularly intrigued Poirot was a phrase mentioned in her letter. The anonymous correspondent had repeatedly used the expression "death by candlelight" in their communications, though Lady Catherine had been frustratingly vague about the specific context. A distinguished butler appeared as if from the shadows themselves. "Monsieur Poirot, Captain Hastings?" he intoned with perfect formality. "Lady Catherine awaits you in the drawing-room." We were led through a series of corridors lined with family portraits, their eyes seeming to follow our progress in the wavering candlelight. The drawing-room, when we reached it, was a study in elegant tension. A fire crackled in the massive stone fireplace, while dozens of candles cast dancing shadows across the richly appointed chamber. The assembled company had the unmistakable air of people who knew each other too well and trusted each other too little. Lady Catherine Thornfield rose to greet us, a woman in her early 60s, still handsome despite the lines of worry that marked her aristocratic features. Her silver hair was arranged with military precision, and her black silk gown, relieved only by a magnificent string of pearls, spoke of wealth tempered by impeccable taste. "Monsieur Poirot, Captain Hastings," she said, her voice carrying the authority of one accustomed to command. Thank you for coming so promptly. I confess I'm at my wit's end with this dreadful business." "You are most wise to seek assistance, madame," Poirot replied with a courtly bow. "In matters of anonymous letters, delay can be unfortunate." Lady Catherine's mouth tightened. "Indeed. Allow me to present my family and guests." Her tone suggested this was a duty rather than a pleasure. She gestured toward a tall, distinguished man in his 40s who stood near the fireplace with a brandy snifter in his hand. "My stepson, Richard Thornfield, who inherited his father's business interests along with his title." Sir Richard Thornfield acknowledged us with a nod that was polite but distinctly cool. He had the bearing of a successful businessman, though there was something in his dark eyes that suggested hidden pressures. His evening dress was impeccable, but I noticed his hands trembled slightly as he raised his glass. "My daughter-in-law, Patricia," Lady Catherine continued, indicating a beautiful woman in her early 30s whose golden hair was arranged in the latest fashion. Lady Patricia's smile was charming but brittle, and her fingers worried constantly at the diamond bracelet on her wrist. "Then we have my nephew, Mr. James Thornfield." Lady Catherine said, her tone noticeably cooler. James was a man of perhaps 35, with a kind of weak, handsome features that suggested a life of easy pleasures and avoided responsibilities. His evening clothes, while well-tailored, had a slightly rumpled appearance, and there was a nervous energy about him that spoke of debts and disappointments. "Miss Eleanor Whitmore," Lady Catherine continued, "my late husband's ward and our dear friend." Miss Whitmore was a striking woman in her late 20s with intelligent dark eyes and prematurely grey hair that she wore with distinction. She acknowledged our introduction with a grave nod, though I noticed her gaze lingered thoughtfully on Poirot's face. And finally, Dr. Marcus Henley, our family physician and trusted friend. Dr. Henley was a compact, energetic man in his 50s with greying hair and the kind of steady, reassuring presence one associates with country doctors. Of all the assembled company, he alone seemed genuinely at ease. "Mr. Geoffrey Ashford," Lady Catherine added with obvious reluctance, indicating a lean, sharp-featured man who had been standing somewhat apart from the others. "A business associate of my late husband's." There was something in her tone that suggested Mr. Ashford's presence was both unwelcome and unavoidable. As the introductions concluded, I became aware of the subtle currents of tension that flowed through the room. Quick glances were exchanged, conversations died abruptly when certain people approached, and there was an overall atmosphere of suppressed anxiety that even the warm candlelight could not dispel. Poirot, I noticed, had positioned himself where he could observe the entire company. His head was tilted slightly to one side in that characteristic manner, and his eyes moved constantly from face to face, cataloguing every expression and gesture. "Lady Catherine," he said quietly, "perhaps you would be so good as to tell us more about these letters you have received." Her composure, which had been admirable until this moment, showed the first signs of cracking. "They began arriving 3 weeks ago," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "At first, they seemed like mere spite, vague accusations and innuendos, but then they became more specific, more threatening." She paused, glancing around the room at her assembled family and guests. They contained information that should have been known only to members of this household. "And the phrase, 'death by candlelight,' madame," Poirot prompted gently. Lady Catherine's face went pale. "That appeared in the most recent letter, received just yesterday. It stated that unless a substantial sum was paid, the truth about death by candlelight would be revealed to the world, bringing scandal and ruin upon the Thornfield name." A heavy silence fell over the room. Sir Richard set down his brandy with a sharp clink, while Lady Patricia's face had gone quite white. James Thornfield was staring fixedly at the floor, and even Dr. Henley looked troubled. It was at this moment that the storm, which had been building throughout the evening, reached its crescendo. A tremendous crash of thunder shook the very foundations of the ancient house, and in the same instant every electric light in the room went out, leaving us illuminated only by the flickering flames of the candles. "Stay calm, everyone," Sir Richard's voice cut through the darkness. "It's merely the storm affecting the electrical system." But even as he spoke, there was a sudden, sharp sound from the direction of the fireplace, a sound like a sigh, followed by the heavy thud of a falling body. Lady Catherine's voice rose in alarm. "Richard! Nurse Richard! Where are you?" Dr. Henley was already moving, his medical training taking precedence over the confusion. "Someone bring a candle," he commanded sharply. Miss Whitmore seized a candelabra from a side table, and its light revealed a scene that would haunt my memory for years to come. Sir Richard Thornfield lay crumpled on the hearth rug, his eyes staring sightlessly at the vaulted ceiling. Protruding from his chest, its ornate handle gleaming in the candlelight, was a silver letter opener, one that I recognized as having been displayed on Lady Catherine's writing desk. Dr. Henley knelt beside the body, his fingers seeking a pulse that would never come again. After a moment, he looked up, his face grave in the flickering light. "I'm afraid Sir Richard is dead," he announced quietly. "Ah, murdered." Poirot moved forward with surprising swiftness for such a small man. He studied the scene with those remarkable eyes of his, taking in every detail, the position of the body, the angle of the weapon, the scattered papers that had fallen from Sir Richard's pocket. "Death by candlelight," he murmured, so softly that only I heard him. Then, raising his voice, he addressed the room with quiet authority. "No one is to leave this room until the police arrive. The telephone lines may be down due to the storm, but Dr. Henley, perhaps you could attempt to reach the authorities?" As Dr. Henley hurried from the room, Poirot's gaze swept over the assembled suspects, for that is what they now were. In the wavering candlelight, their faces seemed to shift and change, revealing glimpses of fear, guilt, and carefully hidden secrets. "Mes amis," said Hercule Poirot, his voice carrying an odd note of satisfaction. "The game, as they say, has begun, and somewhere in this room stands a killer who believed that darkness would hide their crime. But as you will discover, there is no darkness deep enough to conceal the truth from Hercule Poirot." The candles flickered in the draught from the storm-lashed windows, casting dancing shadows across the faces of the guilty and the innocent alike. And in that moment, I knew we were embarked upon one of the most challenging cases of Poirot's remarkable career. The drawing-room had become a theater of shadows and secrets, illuminated only by the flickering candles that cast dancing spectres across the ancient walls. Outside, the November storm raged with increasing fury, rattling the leaded windows and sending drafts through the old manor that made the flames waver ominously. Dr. Henley returned from his mission, shaking rainwater from his coat. His expression was grim as he addressed the assembled company. "The telephone lines are completely down," he announced. "A fallen tree has severed the connection to the village. We are entirely cut off until morning." Poirot nodded as though this news was entirely expected. "Then we must preserve the scene ourselves, mon ami. Dr. Henley, you have examined the body. What can you tell us of the fatal blow?" The physician stepped forward, his professional demeanor intact despite the circumstances. "Death was instantaneous, Monsieur Poirot. The blade pierced the heart directly, driven upward at a precise angle. It required considerable force and knowledge of anatomy." "Ah, how most instructive." Poirot's green eyes gleamed in the candlelight. "An upward thrust suggests either great strength or—" He paused meaningfully. "A person of shorter stature, striking upward with desperate force." He turned to address the room with quiet authority. "Until the police arrive, no one leaves this chamber. We are now, as they say, a closed circle. Captain Hastings, please secure the doors." As I moved to comply, Poirot began his methodical examination. "Lady Catherine, before the darkness fell, where precisely was everyone positioned?" Her voice trembled but remained controlled. Richard stood by the fireplace. Patricia was near him, James at the sideboard. Eleanor and I were by the window, Mr. Ashford near the bookcase. "Doctor, Henley by the mantelpiece." "And when the lights failed?" "It lasted only seconds," Lady Patricia whispered, her face pale as parchment. "I reached for Richard's arm in the darkness. Then I heard a sound. When Miss Whitmore brought the candle, he was already—" James Thornfield interrupted with nervous energy. "I was pouring brandy when the thunder crashed. Dropped my glass. You can see the shards by the sideboard. The noise was tremendous." Poirot examined the broken crystal, his head tilted thoughtfully. "Indeed, a convenient distraction, perhaps, or merely an accident." His gaze swept to Geoffrey Ashford. "And you, monsieur?" "I remained by the window," Ashford replied stiffly. "I saw nothing, heard nothing until Dr. Henley called for light." Miss Whitmore cleared her throat. "Monsieur Poirot, there is something crucial you must know. The letter opener, it was not accessible. Lady Catherine locked it in her writing desk this afternoon. I witnessed this myself." Lady Catherine gasped. Eleanor is correct. I secured it after luncheon, fearing—" She trailed off, her meaning clear. "Magnifique!" Poirot exclaimed softly. "This transforms our puzzle entirely. The weapon was not seized in sudden passion, but deliberately procured beforehand. The murder was premeditated." He knelt beside the body, studying the scattered papers that had fallen from Sir Richard's pocket. "Hastings, observe these financial documents. But more importantly," he pointed to a leather wallet lying open nearby, "the inner compartment has been torn apart. Our killer sought something specific, something small enough to conceal quickly." Rising gracefully, Poirot straightened his waistcoat. "Don't we have learned much in these first moments?" The murderer knew of the coming storm, prepared by obtaining the weapon, and used the darkness to strike and search the victim. But in their haste, they have left us clues. His eyes swept the candlelit faces before him, each hiding secrets, each harboring motives yet to be revealed. "Tomorrow the police will seek fingerprints and footprints," Poirot continued. "Tonight we rely upon psychology. The human heart cannot lie as easily as the human tongue. I shall speak with each of you privately, for in the flickering shadows of memory, truth often reveals itself." He paused, his gaze settling on the silver letter opener that had ended Sir Richard's life. "Someone in this room planned this murder with meticulous care. They believe the darkness would hide their crime, but they have underestimated Hercule Poirot. Before this night ends, the web of deception will begin to unravel." The candles guttered in a sudden draught, and somewhere in the ancient house, a door creaked ominously. The ancient library of Thornfield Abbey provided the perfect sanctuary for Poirot's methodical investigation. Leather-bound volumes lined the walls from floor to ceiling, their gilt titles glinting in the candlelight. Poirot arranged himself behind the massive mahogany desk with characteristic precision, adjusting the silver inkstand and straightening the leather blotter until both satisfied his exacting standards. "We must proceed with the utmost delicacy. Mon ami," he murmured to me as I prepared my notebook. "The human heart under duress reveals its secrets reluctantly, yet it cannot help but betray itself to the observant eye." Lady Catherine entered first, her composure admirable despite the circumstances. She settled into the leather armchair with the dignity of one accustomed to command, though I noticed her hands trembled slightly as she arranged her black silk skirts. "The letters, madame," Poirot began gently. "When did they commence, and what precisely did they contain?" "The first arrived 3 weeks ago," she replied, her voice steady. "It spoke of hidden sins at Thornfield and promised retribution unless matters were set right. Each subsequent letter grew more specific, more threatening." Her composure wavered. "Yesterday's demanded a substantial sum to prevent exposure of death by candlelight." Poirot's green eyes sharpened. "That phrase has significance here." Lady Catherine hesitated, so her denial, ringing hollow, "An old nonsense from years past. Something my husband once said. It could mean nothing to an outsider." "Who besides yourself knew of these communications?" "Richard, naturally. Dr. Henley, whom I consulted about their effect on my health. Eleanor witnessed one arrival. James may have guessed. He has an unfortunate tendency toward financial curiosity." Her tone carried unmistakable bitterness. "Mr. Ashford learned only tonight when Richard lost his temper at dinner." When Lady Catherine departed, Lady Patricia entered like a wraith. The candlelight emphasized her pale beauty, but her hands twisted her handkerchief with nervous energy that spoke of anxiety rather than grief. "You were closest to your husband when darkness fell," Poirot observed gently. "Did you sense anyone approach?" "The thunder was deafening," she whispered. "I reached for Richard, but touched only empty air. Then came that terrible gasp, and the sound of him falling. I was paralyzed with terror." "Your husband was troubled recently?" Her eyes darted toward the shadows. "Richard was always consumed by business, but lately he mentioned severe financial discrepancies. He refused to elaborate." She stiffened defensively. Whatever the family whispers, Monsieur Poirot, I did not marry him for money. James Thornfield swaggered in next, his false bravado transparent. Perspiration beaded his forehead despite the November chill, and his evening clothes bore the telltale signs of a man under considerable strain. Terrible business, he declared, throwing himself into the chair. Poor Richard never saw it coming. You were at the sideboard when the lights failed? The thunder startled me, dropped my glass completely. Next thing I knew, Dr. Henley was calling for candles. Poirot's tone remained conversational. You have debts, do you not, monsieur? James flushed crimson. Half the gentlemen in London have outstanding accounts. But not all have uncles who recently refused payment, Poirot noted quietly. Sir Richard controlled the family finances. His death improves your prospects considerably. Are you accusing me? James sprang to his feet. I was across the room. I accuse no one. I merely gather facts. Geoffrey Ashford entered with calculated composure, his sharp eyes assessing Poirot like a seasoned negotiator facing a worthy opponent. I shall be frank, Monsieur Poirot, he began without preamble. Richard and I were dissolving our partnership. The terms were contentious. He possessed certain documents I required. The documents missing from his wallet, perhaps. Ashford didn't flinch. I know nothing of his wallet's contents. His death complicates my affairs significantly. I have no motive for murder. As the businessman departed, Poirot turned to me, his eyes gleaming with sudden intensity. The pieces scatter before us, Hastings. A widow's protestations, a nephew's desperation, a partner's missing papers. Each claims innocence, yet someone wielded that blade in the darkness. He steepled his fingers thoughtfully. They lie, mon ami. In the shadows cast by their deceptions, we shall discover the truth. Eleanor Whitmore entered the library with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to observing rather than being observed. And the candlelight caught the premature silver in her dark hair, lending her an air of distinction that transcended her modest position as ward. She settled into the leather chair with graceful economy of movement, folding her hands neatly in her lap. Mademoiselle, Poirot began, his voice gentle yet penetrating, you have lived at Thornfield for many years. The household holds few secrets from you, I think. Perhaps fewer than you might suppose, Monsieur Poirot, she replied with a slight smile. But I observe what I can. You wish to know about the letter opener. Indeed. You mentioned it was secured this afternoon. Lady Catherine locked it in her writing desk at 3 o'clock, immediately after receiving another of those dreadful letters. She was quite distressed. I watched her turn the key and place it in her reticule. Eleanor paused, as her intelligent eyes meeting his. However, there is something you should know. The old locks in this house have their peculiarities. The key to the conservatory doors also opens that writing desk. It hangs on a hook in the butler's pantry, accessible to anyone familiar with the house. Poirot's eyebrows rose with interest, most illuminating. And this phrase that troubles Lady Catherine so, death by candlelight. You have heard it before? For the first time, Eleanor's composure wavered slightly. Years ago, before Sir Henry's death, there was a terrible quarrel. The servants still whisper about it. Sir Henry used those exact words during a heated argument with Mr. Ashford. Something about past sins and inevitable consequences. I was quite young then, but the violence of it frightened everyone in the house. And where were you positioned when the lights failed tonight? Near the window with Lady Catherine. I saw Sir Richard speaking intensely with Mr. Ashford by the fireplace. James had just passed them, heading toward the sideboard. When the thunder crashed and darkness fell, Lady Catherine clutched my arm. Neither of us moved until Dr. Henley called for light. When Eleanor departed, Dr. Henley entered, his usual brisk manner subdued by the evening's events. He sank heavily into the chair, rubbing his temples with the gesture of a man under considerable strain. A tragic business, Monsieur Poirot, he said quietly. I've attended this family for 20 years. To see Sir Richard struck down in his own drawing-room, You were standing near the mantelpiece, Doctor. As a man of science, what did your trained senses tell you in those crucial moments?" Dr. Henley's brow furrowed in concentration. The thunder was deafening, but immediately after, I heard Sir Richard draw a sharp breath. Surprise rather than pain. Then came a scuffling sound, the rustle of heavy fabric, and distinctly a metallic clink against the stone hearth. Only then did he fall. "A metallic sound, you say?" Poirot made a careful note. "And Sir Richard's state of mind recently?" "Deeply troubled. He suspected embezzlement within the household and planned to confront the guilty party tonight. The financial discrepancies were substantial." After dismissing the doctor, Poirot sprang from his chair with sudden energy. "Come, Hastings, the doctor's ears have given us a precious gift, and we must examine the scene once more before the police arrive." We hurried back to the drawing room, where Sir Richard's body lay beneath a velvet covering. Poirot immediately knelt upon the cold flagstones of the hearth, holding a candle close to the ground. His search was methodical, intense. "Voilà," he whispered triumphantly, extracting a small object from between the stones with his tweezers. In the candlelight, a heavy gold cufflink gleamed, its surface engraved with ornate initials. "J.T.," I breathed. "James Thornfield. He was right there, Poirot. He created the distraction with his dropped glass, struck his uncle in the darkness, and lost this in the struggle." Poirot slipped the cufflink into a small envelope, his expression thoughtful. "The evidence appears conclusive, mon ami. The motive, the opportunity, the physical proof, all point to Monsieur James. Then surely the case is solved." My friend's green eyes held a troubled gleam. "Ah, Hastings, if only the human heart were so transparent. This evidence shouts guilt with perfect clarity, but the little grey cells, they whisper warnings. We are being guided, mon ami, led carefully down a path illuminated by our true murderer. The game grows more complex with each revelation." The morning light filtering through the ancient windows of Thornfield Abbey seemed pale and weak after the dramatic shadows of the previous night. Yet Poirot insisted on maintaining the candlelit atmosphere in the library, claiming that consistency of environment aided the precision of thought. He sat behind the mahogany desk, the incriminating cufflink gleaming in its small envelope before him. "Well, the evidence presents itself with remarkable clarity, does it not, Hastings?" Poirot mused, adjusting the envelope's position with characteristic precision, almost as though it wishes to be discovered. Before I could respond, James Thornfield entered at our summons, his face haggard from a sleepless night. His evening clothes were wrinkled, his usual swagger completely absent. He moved like a man walking to his execution. "Sit, monsieur," Poirot said gently, sliding the cufflink into view. "This was discovered beside your uncle's body." James stared at the gold ornament as though it were a poisonous serpent. "It's mine," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "But I swear to you, Monsieur Poirot, I didn't drop it there during any struggle. I noticed it missing yesterday afternoon while dressing, and I assumed it had fallen off during my walk in the gardens." "Yesterday afternoon?" Poirot's eyebrows rose with interest. "You mentioned this loss to others?" "Yes. I asked one of the housemaids to search my room, and I complained to Eleanor during tea. Miss Whitmore, I mean. I was frustrated by my wretched luck." James's eyes held desperate hope. "Surely that proves I didn't lose it while murdering Richard." Poirot made a careful note. "Indeed, it suggests much. Tell me, monsieur, who else might have known of this missing jewelry?" "Half the household, I suppose. The servants, certainly. Eleanor helped me search once before when I'd mislaid something. Even Ashford has been in and out of my room making his patronizing observations about my belongings." James's voice grew bitter. They're hardly state secrets. After dismissing James, and I turned to Poirot with confusion. If he's telling the truth about losing it yesterday, then surely. Then someone retrieved it and planted it deliberately. Poirot finished. "But consider the psychology further, mon ami. Picture the scene in darkness. James drops his brandy glass, a genuine accident born of startled nerves. To use this sound as cover, our true murderer must sprint across the room in absolute blackness, locate Sir Richard with perfect precision, and deliver a fatal upward thrust requiring both strength and anatomical knowledge. All within mere seconds. I began to see his point. James hardly seems capable of such coordination. Precisely. He is nervous, clumsy, a man who drops glasses when startled. Yet we are asked to believe he becomes a master assassin in the dark. Poirot shook his head. Thus, the physical evidence shouts his guilt, but the psychology whispers innocence. A sharp knock interrupted us. Geoffrey Ashford entered without invitation, his jaw set in determined lines. I won't be kept waiting like a servant, Monsieur Poirot. Are we suspects or merely inconveniences? Everyone remains suspect until truth emerges, Poirot replied calmly. Pray, sit. I prefer to stand. Ashford's eyes flicked to the cufflink. I assume you found your culprit. The evidence seems conclusive. How curious that you should be so eager to see James condemned, Poirot observed, particularly given your own intimate knowledge of Thornfield's secrets. The phrase, death by candlelight, for instance. Eleanor recalls hearing it during your quarrel with Sir Henry years ago. For the first time, Ashford's composure cracked slightly. Ancient history. Sir Henry was fond of theatrical expressions. We argued over investments. He spoke of playing with fire, used that melodramatic phrase as some sort of warning. It meant nothing. Yet to our anonymous letter writer, it means enough to threaten the family's ruin, Poirot noted. Only someone intimately familiar with Thornfield history could wield such specific knowledge. Ashford's lips tightened. Servants gossip, families quarrel publicly, secrets travel. You're wasting time with these theories. The obvious solution is James. Motive, opportunity, physical evidence. What more do you need? But when solutions present themselves wrapped so neatly, one must examine the wrapping, Poirot replied smoothly. Those who urge haste in judgment rarely do so from love of justice. After Ashford departed in barely concealed anger, Poirot stood and moved to the window. The weak sunlight illuminated his thoughtful expression. Our murderer feels very secure this morning, Hastings. They believe their clever manipulation has satisfied all inquiry. But they underestimate the psychology of guilt. The innocent man protests desperately, as James does. The guilty man either confesses in remorse or, more commonly, directs suspicion elsewhere with calculated precision. He straightened his tie with a decisive gesture. It is time to disturb this comfortable security. We shall let our killer believe their game succeeds completely, and in that confidence they will make the smallest error. Upon that infinitesimal mistake, Hercule Poirot will pounce. The arrival of Inspector Graves shortly after noon brought an air of official gravity to Thornfield Abbey. The inspector was a solid, practical man with sandy hair and the unshakable confidence of one who trusted facts over theories. He examined the cufflink with professional satisfaction, holding the gold ornament up to the pale winter light filtering through the ancient windows. "Well now, Monsieur Poirot," Graves said, carefully placing the evidence in his notebook. "This simplifies matters considerably. James Thornfield, deep in debt, quarreling with his uncle over money, conveniently positioned when the lights failed. The physical evidence places him at the scene. Open and shut, I'd say." James entered at the inspector's summons, his face haggard from a sleepless night. The sight of his cufflink in official hands seemed to drain what little composure he retained. "You recognize this, sir?" Graves asked briskly. "It's mine." Yes," James whispered. "But I lost it yesterday afternoon. I told Monsieur Poirot this morning. I complained to half the household about losing it. Someone planted it there to frame me." "A convenient story," Graves replied skeptically. "You'll remain on the premises under observation until this matter is resolved." After James was escorted away, Graves turned to Poirot with professional courtesy. "Excellent work, sir. You've saved us considerable time." Poirot inclined his head thoughtfully. "I have merely presented facts, Inspector. The interpretation remains yours." "You disagree with the obvious conclusion." "I find evidence that arranges itself so neatly troubling," Poirot replied carefully. "But please, proceed with your investigation." Once Graves departed to interview other household members, Poirot requested that everyone gather in the dining room for a late luncheon. The long mahogany table was illuminated by the same candles that had flickered during the previous night's tragedy, casting dancing shadows across the assembled faces. "It is curious, human nature," Poirot observed, delicately cutting his fish. "When confronted with tragedy, we seek the simplest explanation. The police will see a young man's debts, a convenient distraction, a golden cufflink beside the body. They will declare the case closed." James' fork clattered against his plate. "You cannot believe I'm guilty. Someone is deliberately framing me." "Do not distress yourself, monsieur," Poirot replied gently. "I merely observe what others will conclude. But consider, would a man planning premeditated murder wear his most identifiable jewelry, then carelessly leave it behind?" Geoffrey Ashford leaned forward, his sharp features tense. "Are you suggesting the police are wrong? The evidence seems conclusive." "Murder is rarely simple, Monsieur Ashford," Poirot continued smoothly. "It springs from hidden passions, old sins, desperate fears. Consider the missing documents from Sir Richard's wallet. A panicking killer does not methodically search a corpse in pitch darkness. That requires cold calculation and specific knowledge." Lady Patricia gripped her water-glass tightly. "What documents could be worth murder?" "Perhaps papers proving embezzlement," Poirot suggested quietly. "Or documents relating to an old scandal, a scandal involving death by candlelight." The reaction was immediate and telling. Lady Catherine stiffened as though struck. "Doctor." Sir Henry knocked over his salt cellar, white grains scattering across the polished wood. Eleanor Whitmore lowered her eyes, breathing shallowly. Only Ashford remained motionless, though a muscle twitched in his jaw. "You play dangerous games, Monsieur Poirot," Dr. Henley said harshly, "frightening people with baseless theories." "Merely exploring possibilities, Doctor," Poirot replied apologetically. "Imagine this scenario. The true murderer knew about the missing cufflink. They waited for the storm, knowing the lights would fail. When darkness fell, they struck swiftly upward with anatomical precision, then planted the evidence to ensure blame fell upon an innocent man." The silence was absolute except for the fire's crackling. Poirot's green eyes moved methodically from face to face, cataloguing every micro-expression, every nervous gesture. "But there is one detail," he continued in a hypnotic whisper, "that our clever murderer overlooked. Something so insignificant that only the little grey cells could appreciate its meaning. Tonight, when I reveal this detail, the web of deception will collapse entirely." Rising gracefully, he adjusted his waistcoat with characteristic precision. "The storm is breaking. The police will conclude their work by morning. I suggest you all spend this afternoon reflecting upon your consciences." As we returned to the library, I whispered urgently, "Poirot, do you truly possess this crucial clue?" He chuckled softly, his eyes gleaming with satisfaction. "Not yet, mon ami. But our murderer believes I do, and fear, as you will see, makes even the cleverest criminal careless. Tonight, seeing that fear will drive them to reveal themselves." The afternoon settled over Thornfield Abbey with deceptive calm, though beneath the surface, Poirot's psychological trap was already working its insidious magic. From the library window, I watched Inspector Graves depart for the village, leaving behind only a single constable. The house seemed to exhale with relief, but Poirot's green eyes gleamed with anticipation. "Fear is a powerful motivator, mon ami," he murmured, adjusting his cufflinks with characteristic precision. Our murderer believes themselves secure, but they cannot resist the compulsion to eliminate what they perceive as threats. A soft knock interrupted us. Eleanor Whitmore entered, her composed demeanor masking obvious distress. "Monsieur Poirot, there is something crucial you must understand about death by candlelight. Lady Catherine would prefer the past remain buried, but I fear that secrecy has brought us to this tragedy." Poirot gestured graciously to a chair. "Please, mademoiselle. The truth, however painful, is always preferable to shadows." Eleanor's hands trembled slightly as she began. 20 years ago, during one of Sir Henry's dinner parties, the house lit entirely by candles, as Lady Catherine still insists, there was a terrible fire in the east wing. A maid named Clara was badly burned. She had discovered financial irregularities, whispered accusations about someone in Sir Henry's inner circle profiting from questionable investments. "A convenient accident?" Poirot prompted gently. "Perhaps, but Clara survived long enough to mutter incoherent accusations before she died. Sir Henry was consumed by guilt, repeating obsessively that death by candlelight would be our undoing. The strain destroyed him. He suffered his fatal seizure within months." Poirot leaned forward intently. "And Sir Richard had been investigating this period recently?" "Yes. He'd been examining old correspondence, particularly letters between his father and Mr. Ashford from that time. He asked me to help organize them in the small writing room. He said there were disturbing discrepancies between his father's notes and the official business records. These documents, where are they now?" Eleanor led us through hushed corridors to the narrow writing room overlooking the rose garden. She went directly to a particular tin box, her face growing pale. "They're gone. So there were dozens of letters here. Sir Richard was especially interested in them. Someone has taken everything." Poirot examined the empty box carefully, noting the disturbed dust. "Removed very recently. This confirms much, mademoiselle. The pattern is clear. First the wallet documents, now these historical papers. Our killer systematically destroys evidence of past sins." As Eleanor departed, promising to rest before dinner, Poirot turned to me with satisfaction. "The trap is working, Hastings. Our murderer grows desperate, believing I possess evidence they must eliminate. We need only wait for—" A muffled crash from the floor above cut him short, followed by a sharp, terrified cry that was abruptly silenced. "Vite!" Poirot exclaimed, springing toward the stairs. "The mouse has entered the trap." We found Lady Patricia in the upper corridor, pointing with trembling fingers toward Eleanor's bedroom door. Inside, chaos reigned. Drawers were pulled from furniture, contents scattered everywhere. The mattress lay dragged from the bed, the writing desk forcibly pried open. Eleanor Whitmore lay unconscious against the wardrobe, breathing shallowly. A shattered teacup beside her hand had spilled dark liquid across the Persian rug. "Fetch Dr. Henley immediately," Poirot commanded, kneeling beside her. He sniffed the spilled liquid carefully. Chloral hydrate, tasteless in strong tea. Our killer preferred drugging to murder. Less risk, but still ensuring silence during their search. Dr. Henley arrived swiftly, his medical efficiency evident as he checked Eleanor's pulse and administered a stimulant. "She'll survive, but she needs constant observation." The dosage was precisely calculated, enough to render her unconscious without permanent harm. While the doctor worked, Poirot moved silently through the devastated room. At the small fireplace, he paused, studying the cold ashes. Using his silver tweezers, he carefully extracted partially burned fragments of heavy parchment, examining a melted wax seal. "Regardez, Hastings," he whispered, ensuring the others remained occupied. "These are the missing documents from Sir Richard's wallet. The killer came here not to steal from Mademoiselle Eleanor, but to destroy evidence in her grate while framing her for the theft." His eyes gleamed with cold satisfaction. "In their panic, they have finally made the fatal error I required. The final piece of our puzzle is now perfectly in place." The household gathered anxiously outside Eleanor's bedroom as Dr. Henley completed his examination. The young woman stirred weakly, her eyes fluttering open to focus on the concerned faces surrounding her. Lady Catherine clutched her pearls nervously, while James paced the corridor with barely contained agitation. Lady Patricia stood apart, her face pale but composed, though I noticed her hands trembling slightly. "She will recover completely," Dr. Henley announced, closing his medical bag with professional satisfaction. The dosage was precisely calculated, enough to render unconsciousness without permanent harm. Whoever administered this possessed considerable pharmaceutical knowledge. Poirot's green eyes sharpened at these words, though he merely nodded politely. "Most reassuring, Doctor. Perhaps we should allow Mademoiselle Eleanor to rest while we examine what the intruder sought so desperately." In the library, Poirot carefully arranged the partially burned documents he had rescued from Eleanor's fireplace. The charred fragments told a compelling story when assembled with his characteristic precision. "Observe, Hastings," he murmured, indicating the surviving scraps. "Here, the letterhead of Thornfield Investments, and this signature fragment, Geoffrey Ashe, requires little imagination to complete. But note something far more significant." He pointed to cramped notations in the margins. Two distinct handwriting styles. Sir Henry's bold script, and beneath it, a more clinical hand, references to sedative levels and cardiac strain. "Medical notations," I breathed, understanding dawning. "Precisely. Our conspiracy had two architects, not one. Financial manipulation by Ashford, medical assistance by Dr. Henley." Poirot's tone carried grim satisfaction. "But consider the psychology further, mon ami. Why drug Eleanor rather than simply searching her room while she was elsewhere? Why burn the documents in her fireplace rather than somewhere safer?" Before I could respond, Lady Patricia appeared in the doorway, her composure finally cracking. "Monsieur Poirot, I must speak with you privately. There are things about my husband's death, things I should have mentioned earlier." She settled into the leather chair with visible effort, her usual poise replaced by nervous energy. "Richard had been changing his will," she began quietly. "He intended to sever all financial arrangements with Mr. Ashford and Dr. Henley, and he said some people had profited from his father's weakness for 20 years, and it would end with him. Yet he made no mention of disinheriting James," Poirot prompted gently. "Never. Richard might have reduced his allowance, but he was not vindictive. James was family, whatever his faults." Her voice softened. "My husband played the stern guardian, but he had a kind heart beneath the facade." Poirot made careful notes, then fixed her with a penetrating stare. "Tell me, madam, what brought you to Mademoiselle Eleanor's corridor this afternoon? Your rooms are in the opposite wing." Lady Patricia's composure wavered completely. I was concerned about her after our conversation at luncheon. She seemed distressed by your questions about the past. Yet you found her already unconscious when you arrived." "Yes. The door was ajar, with the room in chaos. I called for help immediately." After she departed, Poirot turned to me with satisfaction. "The pattern becomes clear, Hastings. Someone has orchestrated an elaborate misdirection, first pointing suspicion at James with the planted cufflink, then at Eleanor by drugging her and burning evidence in her room. But they have revealed their greatest fear in the process." He moved to the window, gazing out at the darkening sky. "The letter opener, mon ami, that is the key to everything. Not merely as the murder weapon, but as proof of premeditation. Eleanor witnessed Lady Catherine locking it away, yet someone knew precisely how to retrieve it using the conservatory key from the butler's pantry. Who possesses such intimate knowledge of this house's secrets?" "Someone who has lived here for years," I suggested. "To someone who has attended 3 generations of Thornfields," Poirot agreed. "Someone who understands their weaknesses, their habits, their medical histories. Someone who could strike with anatomical precision in absolute darkness." He consulted his pocket watch with decisive authority. "The time has come to end this elaborate charade. Our murderer believes their misdirection has succeeded, but they have underestimated the psychology of guilt. Tonight, when all the candles burn brightly in the drawing room once more, Hercule Poirot will illuminate the truth they have tried so desperately to hide. The shadows lengthened as evening approached, and somewhere in the ancient house, a killer waited, believing themselves safe behind their carefully constructed web of deception. Now the evening mist had settled over Thornfield Abbey like a burial shroud, and within the great drawing-room, candles flickered with the same ominous intensity as the night before. At Poirot's precise instruction, the household had assembled once more in their exact positions from the previous evening, their faces pale masks of anxiety in the wavering light. Inspector Graves stood near the doorway, his skepticism barely concealed. "I hope this theatrical display serves some purpose, Monsieur Poirot. The evidence against James Thornfield is quite conclusive." Poirot adjusted his waistcoat with characteristic precision, his green eyes gleaming with quiet satisfaction. "Patience, Inspector. Truth, like fine wine, must be properly presented to be fully appreciated." He moved to the center of the room, his small figure commanding absolute attention. "Mes amis, we gather to witness the conclusion of a most elaborate deception, a deception so carefully crafted that it nearly succeeded in condemning an innocent man while allowing a cold-blooded murderer to escape justice." Lady Catherine clutched her pearls, while James Thornfield gripped the back of a chair with white knuckles. Dr. Henley maintained his professional composure, though I noticed a subtle tension in his shoulders. "Let us begin with the obvious suspect," Poirot continued, his voice carrying the hypnotic quality that marked his greatest revelations. "Monsieur James, deep in debt, quarreling with his uncle, conveniently positioned when the lights failed. And beside the body, his golden cufflink gleaming like an accusation in the candlelight." James flinched, but Poirot raised a reassuring hand. "But consider the psychology, Inspector. Here is a man whose nerves are so frayed that thunder makes him drop his brandy glass. Are we to believe that in pitch darkness he transformed into a silent assassin, striking with surgical precision before carelessly leaving his most identifiable possession behind?" Poirot shook his head with gentle reproach. "No, the cufflink was stolen the previous afternoon. James himself complained of its loss to half the household. It was planted by someone who understood that physical evidence would satisfy the authorities, while psychological truth would be ignored." He began to pace with measured steps, each movement calculated for maximum effect. When this first deception seemed insufficient, our killer grew desperate. Sir Richard had been investigating the past, specifically the tragedy 20 years ago when the maid Clara died in that convenient fire. Sir Richard possessed documents proving her death was no accident, but murder to conceal massive embezzlement. Geoffrey Ashford's jaw tightened, but he remained silent. Dr. Henley's steady gaze never wavered, though his breathing had become slightly more rapid. "These documents had to be destroyed," Poirot continued. "So our killer entered Mademoiselle Eleanor's room, administered a precise dose of chloral hydrate in her tea, measured with the expertise of someone intimately familiar with pharmaceutical calculations, and burned the papers in her fireplace. They hoped to frame her as the blackmailer, destroying evidence when the investigation closed in." Eleanor Whitmore, still pale from her ordeal, pressed her handkerchief to her lips. Lady Patricia's face had gone ashen. "But again, the psychology betrayed the killer," Poirot said, his voice rising slightly. "The papers were burned in Eleanor's room, not from cunning, but from necessity. The killer could not risk carrying them through the corridors where they might be discovered." He stopped before the fireplace, pointing to the exact spot where Sir Richard had fallen. "Now we come to the murder itself. The letter opener was locked away, yet someone knew the conservatory key would open Lady Catherine's writing desk. Someone with intimate knowledge of this house's secrets, accumulated over many years of trusted access. The silence was absolute except for the soft hiss of burning wax. Poirot's gaze swept the room like a searchlight seeking its target. when the storm struck and darkness fell. Our killer did not need to search for Sir Richard in the chaos. They were already standing directly beside him, his eyes fixed on Dr. Henley. You told us, Doctor, that you heard Sir Richard draw a sharp breath of surprise, then a scuffle, then distinctly a metallic clink against the stone hearth, followed by the sound of his falling. Dr. Henley nodded carefully. That is correct, Monsieur Poirot. I reported exactly what I heard. Ah, but you revealed more than you intended, Poirot said softly. You described the sounds in perfect sequence: surprise, struggle, metallic clink, then the fall. But how could you know the clink came from the planted cufflink striking the stone unless you were the one who dropped it there? The color drained from Dr. Henley's face, but his voice remained steady. You're making assumptions, Monsieur Poirot, and I simply reported what I heard in the confusion. The fatal blow, Poirot continued inexorably, was delivered with anatomical perfection, directly upward into the heart. You yourself noted this precision, Doctor. You also calculated the exact chloral hydrate dosage needed to render Eleanor unconscious without permanent harm. Such pharmaceutical expertise is not common among our suspects. He stepped closer to the physician, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. 20 years ago, you helped Geoffrey Ashford cover up his embezzlement by ensuring Clara's silence permanently. The accidental fire was your suggestion, was it not? And when Sir Henry grew suspicious and began suffering from guilt-induced stress, you were there with your medical expertise to ease his passing. Dr. Henley's composure finally began to crack. These are wild accusations, Monsieur Poirot. I am a healer, not a killer. You are a man who has balanced doses and consciences with remarkable dexterity for 2 decades, Poirot replied. When Sir Richard began investigating the past, you knew your carefully buried secrets would be exposed. So you retrieved the letter opener, waited for the storm, and when darkness fell, you struck with the precision of your medical training. The physician's hands trembled slightly, but he maintained his denial. You cannot prove any of this. Poirot smiled with cold satisfaction. Can I not? Tomorrow, Inspector Graves will search your surgery and find traces of chloral hydrate. He will examine your financial records and discover payments from Ashford spanning 20 years. Most damning of all, he will find the anonymous letters in your own handwriting, disguised, but unmistakably yours to a trained graphologist. The candles flickered in a sudden draft, and in that wavering light I saw the final collapse of Dr. Henley's carefully maintained facade. His shoulders sagged, and for the first time in 20 years, the mask of the trusted family physician slipped away to reveal the calculating killer beneath. The game, said Hercule Poirot quietly, is finally at an end. The silence that followed Poirot's accusation stretched like a taut wire through the candlelit drawing room. Dr. Marcus Henley stood motionless beside the fireplace, his professional composure finally cracking like ice under sudden pressure. The flickering flames cast dancing shadows across his face, revealing glimpses of the calculating mind that had orchestrated 20 years of deception. You are remarkably thorough, M. Poirot, Henley said at last, his voice stripped of its usual warmth. I wondered how long it would take someone to notice the inconsistencies. Lady Catherine gasped, pressing her handkerchief to her lips. Marcus, tell him it isn't true. You've been our family physician for decades. You delivered Richard, treated his childhood fevers, guided him through— I guided him to his grave, Henley interrupted with bitter finality. Just as I guided Clara to hers 20 years ago, and Sir Henry when his conscience became inconvenient. The admission hit the room like a physical blow. James Thornfield sank into a chair, his face pale with shock and relief. Lady Patricia moved instinctively to his side, while Eleanor Whitmore, still weak from her ordeal, gripped the arm of her chair with white knuckles. The metallic clink, Poirot continued inexorably, was your fatal error, Doctor. In the chaos of that thunderous moment, with fabric rustling and people gasping in surprise, a small gold cufflink falling onto stone would be inaudible from the mantelpiece. Yet you described hearing it with perfect clarity because you were the one who dropped it, deliberately, precisely, before delivering the fatal thrust. Inspector Graves stepped forward, his earlier skepticism replaced by grim determination. "Dr. Marcus Henley, I am arresting you for the murder of Sir Richard Thornfield and the attempted murder of Miss Eleanor Whitmore." As the handcuffs clicked shut around Henley's wrists, Geoffrey Ashford made a desperate movement toward the door. The constable stationed there blocked his path with crossed arms. "Not so fast, Mr. Ashford," Graves said firmly. "Monsieur Poirot has provided considerable evidence of your complicity in both recent events and the death of Clara 20 years ago. Financial records, correspondence, witness testimony. You'll be accompanying the doctor." Ashford's sharp features contorted with rage, but he offered no resistance as the second pair of handcuffs secured his wrists. The two conspirators, bound together by decades of greed and blood, were led from the drawing room into the storm-lashed night. The great room felt suddenly vast and empty, the oppressive atmosphere of secrets finally lifted. Poirot moved to straighten a crooked candlestick on the mantelpiece, his small gesture somehow restoring order to the chaos. "Will they recover?" I asked quietly, watching the shattered family begin to process their ordeal. "People are resilient, Hastings," Poirot replied thoughtfully. "Lady Catherine will age suddenly, but perhaps grow kinder. Mademoiselle Eleanor has learned that knowledge, though painful, provides strength. As for Monsieur James," he allowed himself a slight smile, "the shock of nearly being hanged may accomplish more for his character than years of indulgence ever could." Lady Catherine approached us, her aristocratic bearing intact despite the evening's revelations. "You have torn away veils I never wanted lifted, Monsieur Poirot. Yet I suppose ignorance is a form of cowardice. I thank you, even if I cannot quite forgive the necessity." "Madame," Poirot bowed slightly, "justice does not ask for gratitude, only for truth. Your son sought that truth. It is fitting that his efforts were not in vain." As we prepared to depart, Poirot paused in the doorway, gazing back at the sea of flickering candles. "It is curious, mon ami, how our murderer chose darkness as his ally, yet it was the candlelight that ultimately betrayed him. Physical evidence may lie, may be arranged and manipulated. But human psychology, that reveals itself in the smallest gesture, the tiniest inconsistency." He adjusted his hat to the perfect angle, his mustaches immaculate despite the evening's drama. "Murder is rarely born in a moment, Hastings. It grows from small doses of self-deception, justified by noble intentions and necessary evils. One convinces oneself that others are too weak for truth, that one's judgment is superior, and then, inevitably, the final dose is administered." Outside, the storm had passed, leaving the sky washed clean above Thornfield Abbey's ancient silhouette. "Ah, come," said Hercule Poirot with satisfaction. "The affair of death by candlelight is concluded. Somewhere else, no doubt, another tragedy prepares itself. But until then, we shall enjoy a comfortable train, a good dinner, and perhaps a chocolate mousse of exemplary symmetry." The candles continued to burn in the empty drawing-room, their steady flames now guardians of truth rather than witnesses to deception. The comfortable familiarity of our London rooms provided welcome respite from the shadowy corridors of Thornfield Abbey. A week had passed since that dramatic revelation, and the morning papers were filled with scandalous details of Dr. Marcus Henley's arrest. I found Poirot at his desk, methodically arranging correspondence with characteristic precision, humming softly as he worked. "The papers are calling him the most calculating medical killer in decades," I observed, folding the Times with distaste. Yet when we first encountered him, he seemed the most rational person in that entire household. I confess, Poirot, I never suspected him until your final revelation." Poirot paused in his sorting, his green eyes thoughtful. That, mon ami, was precisely his greatest weapon, the disguise of absolute normality. A physician is granted unparalleled access to our lives, our secrets, our vulnerabilities. We do not question the doctor who inquires about our health, nor suspect the hand that administers our medicine. Henley used this inherent trust as both shield and sword. But the anonymous letters, I persisted. If he wished to keep the past buried, why draw attention to it at all? But you misunderstand his strategy, Hastings. Poirot's voice carried that familiar note of intellectual satisfaction. The letters were not warnings. They were misdirection. By creating the spectre of an outside blackmailer, Henley provided the perfect scapegoat. When Sir Richard inevitably died, suspicion would fall upon this mysterious enemy, or perhaps the debt-ridden James. The letters destabilized the household precisely as intended. He rose and moved to the window, gazing out at the London rain. Henley possessed the supreme arrogance of one who views others as chess pieces rather than human beings. He believed his intellect vastly superior, his manipulations undetectable. But such minds always underestimate their opponents. The metallic clink, I said suddenly, understanding dawning. That was his fatal error. Précisément, Poirot exclaimed, turning with animated satisfaction. In his eagerness to frame James, he planted the cufflink with theatrical precision, but his ego demanded he demonstrate his supposed innocence by describing each sound in perfect sequence. He forgot that in a room filled with thunder and chaos, only the person dropping the gold could hear it strike stone. The little grey cells, they listen not merely to what is said, but to what is impossible to have heard. A knock interrupted us. Inspector Graves entered, shaking rainwater from his coat. "The case is proceeding smoothly, Monsieur Poirot. Henley's surgery yielded a private stock of chloral hydrate far exceeding legitimate medical needs. His financial records show regular payments from Ashford spanning 20 years. Most damning. And we discovered his practice notes detailing the precise dosages used on Clara and Sir Henry. The man documented his own crimes." After Graves departed, I reflected on the human cost. What of the others, Poirot? The innocent caught in this web? They will heal, Hastings. Truth is a painful surgeon, but it excises the rot completely. His voice softened with rare warmth. James has secured honest employment, terrified into responsibility by his brush with the gallows. Eleanor will manage the estate with Lady Catherine, bringing light to those long-shadowed halls. The family will survive, perhaps grow stronger for having faced their demons. He returned to his desk, straightening papers with meticulous care. "You know, mon ami, the phrase 'death by candlelight' revealed more than our killer intended. Lady Catherine preferred the illusion of the past to the reality of the present. Similarly, our murderers relied on old methods, quiet doses, convenient fires, darkness, and misdirection. They forgot that the modern world leaves traces everywhere, in bank ledgers, in medical notes, in the psychology of witnesses. And in the memories of Hercule Poirot," I added with a smile. "The affair at Thornfield Abbey," he continued thoughtfully, "was never truly about candles or darkness. It was about the moments when people choose not to see. Most tragedies begin not with action, Hastings, but with averted eyes. Lady Catherine ignored financial irregularities. The household staff whispered but never spoke. Even Sir Henry, consumed by guilt, chose death over confrontation." He closed his eyes briefly, as if filing the entire case away in some inner cabinet of solved mysteries. But truth, like candlelight, cannot be extinguished by darkness. It may flicker, may be obscured, but it burns eternal. That is why Hercule Poirot exists, to tend those flames when others would snuff them out. The rain continued its steady rhythm against our windows, washing the city clean. Somewhere in that vast metropolis, other secrets festered in shadow, other truths awaited discovery. But for now, justice had been served, and the candles of Thornfield Abbey burned bright with honesty at last. The crisp February morning brought London's familiar sounds through the windows of our Baker Street apartment, a welcome contrast to the storm-lashed silence we had left at Thornfield Abbey. Poirot sat at his breakfast table, he methodically arranging his morning correspondence with characteristic precision when our landlady announced an unexpected visitor. Eleanor Whitmore entered with a transformation that was immediately apparent. The oppressive weight that had burdened her shoulders at Thornfield had lifted entirely, replaced by the quiet confidence of someone who had finally stepped from beneath generational shadows. Her prematurely silver hair caught the morning light, and her navy walking suit spoke of newfound independence. "Mademoiselle Eleanor," Poirot exclaimed, rising with courtly grace, "this is indeed a pleasure most unexpected. You bring news from the country, I hope." "The best of news, Monsieur Poirot," she replied, settling into the offered chair. "The estate breathes freely again. Lady Catherine has ordered the heavy curtains drawn back. And we've installed electric lighting throughout the house. The shadows are finally banished." She paused, producing a leather-bound ledger from her handbag. "But I came specifically to bring you this." The ledger bore the unmistakable signs of careful concealment, worn edges, faded ink, and the systematic organization of a methodical mind bent toward deception. Poirot's eyes gleamed with interest as Eleanor explained, "While clearing Mr. Ashford's private office, James and I discovered his cipher book. It contains the complete mathematical record of their 20-year conspiracy. I thought your meticulous mind would appreciate seeing the final proof of their systematic theft." Poirot opened the ledger with reverent care, his finger tracing the columns of figures that told their damning story. "Observe, Hastings," he murmured, "and see how our criminals believed numbers would conceal their sins, forgetting that mathematics possesses an absolute truth of its own." The calculations were methodically laid out across multiple pages. Ashford had been diverting exactly £1,250 from the estate's quarterly income for 20 years. The mathematical progression was chillingly precise. Quarterly theft equals £1,250. Annual theft equals £1,250. Times 4 equals £5,000. 20-year total equals £5,000. Times 20 equals £100,000. "A fortune built upon 3 graves," Poirot observed quietly. "Dr. Henley received precisely 30% of each quarter's theft, £375 every 3 months for his medical services. The partnership was as methodical as it was murderous." "It's chilling," I said, staring at the cold figures that had cost Clara, Sir Henry, and Sir Richard their lives. To reduce murder to variables in a financial equation. "That is precisely the nature of such crimes, mon ami," Poirot replied, closing the ledger with finality. "To the calculating killer, human beings cease to be people. They become obstacles, liabilities, or assets to be managed. Dr. Henley viewed his victims not as living souls, but as unacceptable risks to his financial equilibrium." Eleanor's voice carried quiet satisfaction. "James has found his conscience at last. He works alongside the estate managers daily and has sold his expensive motor car to settle his London debts. The shock of nearly being hanged for a murder he didn't commit has transformed him completely." After Eleanor departed, leaving the ledger for Inspector Graves, Poirot moved to his mantelpiece. He adjusted a pair of porcelain vases until they achieved perfect symmetry, then turned to me with thoughtful eyes. "You know, Hastings, there was one detail I did not share during our dramatic revelation at Thornfield." From his waistcoat pocket, he produced a small object wrapped in tissue paper. Dr. Henley's medical bag yielded this, a silver locket containing Clara's photograph, worn smooth by 20 years of guilty handling. The locket was tarnished with age, its surface bearing the unmistakable signs of constant contact. Inside, a young woman's face smiled out from a faded daguerreotype. Clara, the maid whose death had begun the entire tragic chain. He kept this, I asked, astonished. Remorse, mon ami, is like a poison that works slowly through the system. Henley administered it to himself in carefully measured doses for 2 decades. He told himself he was a healer, a guardian of the greater good, but his conscience knew better. The locket was his private penance, and ultimately, his confession. Poirot returned the locket to his pocket with gentle care. The affair of death by candlelight is truly concluded now. The mathematical proof of their greed, the physical evidence of their guilt, and the psychological testimony of their remorse all combine to illuminate a truth that no shadow can obscure. He moved to the window, gazing out at the bustling London street with satisfaction. Lady Catherine writes that they have established a charitable fund in Clara's memory for injured domestic servants. Eleanor insisted upon it, she says. Sometimes Hastings, the living may learn wisdom from the dead, if they will but listen. And the house itself? I asked. Filled with light at last, Poirot replied with quiet contentment. Electric bulbs have replaced the endless candles. The shadows that concealed 20 years of sin have been banished by the simple act of illumination. It is, perhaps, the most fitting memorial to those who died in darkness. He straightened his tie with characteristic precision, his moustaches twitching with satisfaction. Come, mon ami. We have restored order from chaos, brought light to shadow, and balanced the scales of justice. Now we shall enjoy a perfectly symmetrical luncheon and allow the little grey cells their well-deserved rest, until inevitably some new human folly demands their services once more. The morning sun streamed through our windows, banishing every shadow from the room, as Hercule Poirot closed the final chapter on the affair at Thornfield Abbey.